Alara Vance considered the polished mahogany table, laden with crisp white linens and sparkling champagne flutes, a world away from the worn linoleum of her childhood kitchen. At 32, she was the founder of Crimson Quill Publishing, a small but fiercely independent press she'd built from the ground up. It hadn't been easy. The initial capital had come from years of waitressing. Every dollar saved a testament to her relentless drive. She'd poured that money and her soul into her first novel, a gritty urban fantasy that the mainstream New York publishing houses had deemed too niche. So she'd published it herself. 5 years and 3 best-selling books later, Crimson Quill was not just her company. It was her victory banner. Tonight, she was a guest of honor at the annual Literary Lions Gala in New York City, a glittering affair that brought together the biggest names in the book world. She wore a simple, elegant navy gown, a stark contrast to the flamboyant couture that peppered the room. She felt a familiar twinge of imposter syndrome, a phantom sensation from the days when her biggest concern was whether a table of 6 would order enough to make her rent. She'd learned to silence that voice, to remind herself that she'd earned her seat at this table, not through connections or inherited wealth, but through sheer tenacity and the power of her own words. Across the room, holding court like a modern-day Marie Antoinette, was Serafina Blackwood. Serafina was literary royalty, the daughter of a publishing magnate and a celebrated poet. Her own debut, a languid, navel-gazing novel about the ennui of the ultra-rich, had been anointed an instant classic by critics who were, coincidentally, old family friends. She was beautiful, impeccably dressed in a shimmering silver gown that probably cost more than Alara's first print run, and she radiated an aura of effortless superiority. The event organizer, a flustered man named David, led Alara toward Serafina's circle. "Serafina, darling," he gushed, "I'd like you to meet Alara Vance. She's the brilliant mind behind Crimson Quill Publishing." Serafina's eyes, the color of glacial ice, swept over Alara, taking in the simple dress and the quiet confidence. A small, disdainful smile played on her perfectly glossed lips. "Oh, the self-publishing girl," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those around them. The term was delivered not as a description, but as a dismissal. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Serafina," Alara said, extending her hand. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "I've heard a lot about your work." Serafina ignored the offered hand, instead taking a delicate sip of her champagne. "Self-publishing. How quaint. It's rather like those little craft fairs, isn't it? Everyone gets a gold star for participation." The circle of admirers around Serafina tittered politely. Alara felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks. This was the attitude she'd fought against since day one, the snobbery of the establishment, the belief that art was only valid if it passed through their hallowed gates. "I think it's more about creating a direct line to readers," Alara countered, keeping her tone light. "Bypassing the gatekeepers to give audiences what they truly want to read, not just what a committee thinks they should." Serafina raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "What they want? Darling, the masses want reality television and greasy cheeseburgers. It's our job as curators of culture to elevate their tastes, not to pander to them." She gestured vaguely at the opulent room. "Real authors, the ones with legacy and substance, understand that. We have a responsibility to the craft. We don't just print our diaries and call it a day." The insult, though veiled, was clear. Serafina saw Alara as a lesser creature, a hobbyist playing at being a professional. David, the organizer, looked increasingly uncomfortable, shooting Alara an apologetic glance before being pulled away by another guest. Alara was left standing in the lioness's den, the implicit challenge hanging in the air. This wasn't just a disagreement about publishing models. It was a clash of worlds. It was the disdain of the born rich for the self-made, the contempt of the gatekeeper for the one who had dared to build her own door. The battle lines had been drawn, not with a roar, but with the quiet, cutting condescension of a woman who had never known a day of struggle in her life. The initial sting of Serafina's condescension lingered, but Alara was a veteran of navigating uncomfortable social situations. She politely excused herself, deciding to focus on the real reason she was there: to connect with booksellers and distributors. For the next hour, she moved through the grand ballroom, her professionalism a shield. She spoke with passion about her authors, about the burgeoning market for diverse voices, and the power of communities built online. She secured promising meetings and felt the familiar thrill of her hard work paying off. The incident with Serafina was a sour note, but she was determined not to let it ruin the symphony of her success. Her brief respite was shattered when the gala's host took the stage for the evening's main event, the presentation of the Literary Lion Award. This year, to everyone's surprise, it was being awarded not to an individual author, but to an anonymous figure who had captured the industry's heart, the writer of the blog The Gilded Page. For years, The Gilded Page had been the industry's most insightful, and sometimes scathing critic. The blogger wrote with unparalleled wit and a deep, abiding love for literature, championing hidden gems and fearlessly calling out the empty commercial husks that often dominated bestseller lists. They were revered, their identity a source of endless speculation. After a flowery speech about the blogger's impact, the host announced a special panel discussion on the future of literature, featuring a handful of the night's most influential guests. He called out the names: a celebrated historian, a Pulitzer-winning journalist, and then, the ever-dazzling Serafina Blackwood. A wave of applause followed, and, the host continued, consulting his notes, representing the bold new frontier of independent publishing, let's welcome Alara Vance. A smattering of polite, more muted applause accompanied Alara to the stage. She took her seat at the far end of the panel, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Serafina was seated 2 chairs down, a smug, predatory gleam in her eyes. It felt less like a panel and more like an ambush. The discussion started predictably. The moderator asked about trends, about the impact of social media. Alara spoke articulately about the agility of independent presses to respond to reader desires, using data and direct engagement. Serafina, in turn, lamented the death of nuance and the vulgarity of chasing trends. The tension was a low hum beneath the surface, a discordant note only some could hear. Then, the moderator turned to Serafina. Serafina, your last novel was lauded for its literary purity. What do you see as the biggest threat to that kind of quality in today's landscape? Serafina leaned into her microphone, her silver dress catching the stage lights. Her eyes locked onto Alara. The biggest threat, she began, her voice dripping with theatrical gravity, is the complete erosion of standards. It's the democratization of art to the point of meaninglessness. When anyone, and I do mean anyone, can simply print their unedited thoughts and call it a novel, the very definition of author is degraded. She didn't need to say Alara's name. Every head on the panel, and many in the audience, swiveled to look at the woman at the end of the table. Alara kept her composure. I believe it's about opening doors, not lowering standards, she interjected calmly. Some of the most innovative stories are coming from outside the traditional system, because they aren't afraid to take risks. Risks? Serafina scoffed, a cruel laugh escaping her lips. Is that what we're calling it? I've heard about your humble origins, Ms. Vance. It's a very compelling narrative, I'm sure. But let's be honest. What is a waitress from? Where was it? Ohio. Truly know about literary tradition. The air was sucked out of the room. The attack was no longer veiled. It was a public execution. Whispers rippled through the audience. It was one thing to be a snob in a private circle. It was another to publicly weaponize someone's past on a lit stage. My past taught me the value of hard work, Alara said, her voice tight, the blood pounding in her ears. It taught me what real people, the people who actually buy books, want to read on their commute home from jobs just like the one I had. Oh, please, Serafina waved a dismissive hand, playing to the crowd. Don't sell us this working-class hero fantasy. This isn't about hard work. It's about pedigree. It's about a lifetime of immersion in culture and letters. It's something you can't just pick up between bussing tables and refilling ketchup bottles. The laughter from some corners of the audience was like a physical blow. Alara felt utterly alone on that stage, a specimen under a microscope. The moderator, clearly out of his depth, stammered, trying to regain control, but Serafina wasn't finished. She holds up her little company as some kind of revolution, Serafina continued, her voice rising with righteous indignation. But what is it, really? A vanity project. A place for writers who aren't good enough to get a real publishing deal. It's a testament not to talent, but to the fact that with enough grit and a credit card, Anyone can print a book. But that doesn't make her an author, and it certainly doesn't make her a publisher of any merit. It makes her a glorified Kinko's clerk. The final insult landed. The room was a mixture of shocked silence and the cruel snickers of Serafina's sycophants. Alara sat, paralyzed and humiliated, under the hot glare of the stage lights. She had built her castle with her own 2 hands, stone by painful stone, and in a matter of moments Serafina Blackwood had tried to convince the world it was nothing more than a sandcastle, waiting to be washed away by the tide of her own inherited importance. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time in a long time she was speechless, the waitress from Ohio all over again. The silence on the stage was thick and suffocating. Alara's mind raced, searching for a retort, a defense, anything to push back against the crushing weight of Serafina's attack. But her throat was tight, her confidence shattered into a million pieces. The smirks in the audience, the uncomfortable shifting of the other panelists, it was all a blur of humiliation. Serafina sat back, basking in her perceived victory, the very picture of smug satisfaction. Just as the moderator finally found his voice to stammer out a transition, a figure rose from a front-row table. He was an older man, dressed in a simple but well-tailored tweed jacket that seemed out of place amidst the glitter and silk. But every eye in the room turned to him, and a hush fell over the crowd. It was Marcus Thorne. Marcus Thorne was more than an author. He was a living legend. A man who had clawed his way out of a Pennsylvania coal mining town to become one of the most critically acclaimed and beloved novelists of his generation. His books were dense, compassionate, and brutally honest, and he was known for his fierce integrity and his utter lack of patience for the industry's pomp and circumstance. When Marcus Thorne spoke, everyone, from critics to CEOs, listened. He walked calmly to the side of the stage, and a technician, wide-eyed, practically scrambled to hand him a microphone. He didn't look at the moderator or the other panelists. His gaze, sharp and discerning, was fixed first on Serafina, then settled with a surprising softness on Alara. "I've been listening to this discussion with great interest," Marcus began, his voice a low, resonant baritone that filled the hall without any effort. "Particularly Ms. Blackwood's passionate defense of pedigree and standards." Serafina preened slightly, assuming she was about to be praised by the master himself. "Marcus," she said, inclining her head. "A pleasure to see you." He gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. "You speak of what makes a real author. You speak of legacy, and you denigrate Ms. Vance for her past, for her work ethic, for building something from nothing. You call her a Kinko's clerk." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with accusation. "It's a fascinating perspective, especially since, for the past 4 years, you, like every other person of influence in this room, have been hanging on the every word of a waitress from Ohio." A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Serafina's smile faltered. "I am not sure I understand what you mean, Marcus." Marcus's eyes twinkled, but his expression was grim. "I'm talking about the Gilded Page," he said, his voice rising in volume. "The anonymous blogger we've gathered to honor tonight. The most trusted, most insightful, and most important critical voice in American letters today. The one person who has consistently championed authentic storytelling and eviscerated the kind of hollow, pretentious drivel that values style over substance." He turned his gaze back to Serafina, and it was now hard as flint. "I remember a post from last year. It was about your novel, Ms. Blackwood. The Gilded Page called it a beautifully wrapped but entirely empty box, and a tedious monument to unearned privilege. It was a brilliant, devastating, and entirely accurate piece of criticism. You yourself called the review vile and anti-intellectual in a subsequent interview, didn't you?" Serafina had gone pale, her practiced composure crumbling. "That has nothing to do with this," she hissed. "Oh, I think it has everything to do with this," Marcus countered, his voice booming through the speakers. "Because you see, I've known for a while who the Gilded Page is. We've corresponded for years, sharing a frustration with the state of publishing. We bonded over a belief that great stories can come from anywhere, and that hard work, not a family name, is what defines a writer. And I can tell you, she is not a glorified Kinko's clerk. She is the sharpest mind in this room." He turned and looked directly at Alara, a profound respect in his eyes. He raised his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus Thorne announced to the stunned and silent room, "allow me to introduce you to the founder of Crimson Quill Publishing, a woman who worked nights to fund her dream, who built a platform for voices like hers, and who, in her spare time, has been the single most influential critic of our generation. The author of The Gilded Page is Alara Vance." The reveal landed with the force of a thunderclap. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. People were on their feet, heads whipping between a horrified, ashen-faced Serafina and a completely stunned Alara. Her mind was reeling. Marcus Thorne? He knew. The truth settled in, and with it came a seismic shift in the room's atmosphere. The snickers that had been directed at her moments before now turned into looks of awe and embarrassment. The people who had laughed at the waitress joke now realized they were laughing at the anonymous genius they all revered. Alara looked at Serafina. The snob, the queen bee, looked small and utterly exposed. Her public execution had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. She had tried to humiliate Alara by weaponizing her past, only to have that same past revealed as the bedrock of the very integrity and insight that made her so admired. The waitress from Ohio wasn't just at the table. Marcus Thorne had just proven to everyone that she had built the damn table herself, and had been critiquing everyone else's place at it all along. The reversal was total, absolute, and devastatingly public. The silence that followed Marcus Thorne's revelation was shattered by a single explosive sound: applause. It started with a few people at the back, then swelled into a thunderous rolling ovation. It wasn't the polite, measured clapping from earlier in the evening. This was a genuine, heartfelt roar of approval and astonishment. The very people who had watched in silent complicity or snickered at her humiliation were now on their feet, their faces alight with respect for the woman they had so thoroughly misjudged. Alara sat frozen for a moment, the sound washing over her. A wave of validation so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She looked down the panel table at Serafina. The blood had drained from the other woman's face, leaving behind a sickly, mottled pallor. Her mask of aristocratic poise had been utterly incinerated, leaving only the ugly, raw features of petty cruelty and shock. She met Alara's gaze for a fleeting second, her eyes filled not with apology, but with a venomous, cornered animal hatred. Then, with a jerky, ungraceful movement, Serafina pushed her chair back, mumbled something incoherent to the moderator, and practically fled the stage, her silver dress seeming to mock her hasty, shameful retreat. Her exit was not mourned. It was barely noticed amidst the standing ovation for Alara. Marcus Thorne stepped onto the stage and offered Alara his hand. As she took it, he pulled her gently to her feet. The applause grew louder. He leaned in and whispered, his voice for her alone. "The Gilded Page is the conscience of this industry. It's about time the conscience got a face." When the panel was officially and chaotically concluded, Alara was mobbed. Not by sycophants, but by writers, editors, and booksellers who had long admired her anonymous blog. A young novelist whose debut Alara had championed on The Gilded Page approached her, his eyes shining with tears. "You have no idea what your review did for me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my career." The publisher of a rival small press, a man who had always been a professional but distant competitor, shook her hand firmly. "You've been playing chess while the rest of us were playing checkers, Vance. My respect." Her small team from Crimson Quill, who had been watching from the audience, pushed through the crowd, their faces beaming with fierce pride. They weren't just employees, they were believers, and their faith had just been spectacularly vindicated. Later that evening, in a quieter corner of the ballroom, Marcus Thorne made her an offer. "I've been thinking of starting a new imprint for a while," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Something focused on narrative fiction that isn't afraid to get its hands dirty. But I'm a writer, not a businessman. You, Ms. Vance, are clearly both." He looked at her directly. "I want to invest in Crimson Quill. I want to give you the capital to expand, to hire more staff, to acquire more authors. On one condition." Alara's heart beat faster. "What's the condition?" "That you don't change a thing about how you choose your books," he said with a wry smile. "And that you let me write the foreword for your next novel." It was more than she could have dreamed of. It wasn't just money, it was an endorsement from the one person whose respect she valued above all others. This night, which had begun with her feeling like an imposter, was ending with her being recognized as a pillar of the community. The humiliation she had endured at Serafina's hands had, ironically, become the catalyst for her greatest triumph. It had stripped away her anonymity but solidified her identity. She was no longer just Alara Vance, the self-published author. She was Alara Vance, the founder of Crimson Quill Publishing, a kingmaker, a respected publisher, and the uncompromising voice of the Gilded Page. She had earned her success not by fitting in with the Seraphinas of the world, but by staying true to the values she'd learned long ago as a waitress in Ohio. Work hard, be honest, and never ever let anyone make you feel like you're not worthy of your seat at the table. 6 months after the night of the gala, the offices of Crimson Quill Publishing were buzzing with an energy that was almost electric. The space, once a cramped, utilitarian loft, had been expanded into the adjacent unit, with sunlight streaming through large industrial windows onto new desks and bustling employees. Marcus Thorne's investment had been a tidal wave of opportunity, allowing Alara to hire a dedicated publicity team and double her editorial staff. Crimson Quill wasn't just an indie darling anymore, it was a serious player, a beacon for talented writers who felt ignored by the monolithic towers of traditional publishing. Alara's own notoriety had skyrocketed. She had decided to continue writing the Gilded Page, but now under her own name. The transition from anonymous critic to public figurehead had been daunting, but her voice, now attached to her face and her story, carried even more weight. She was featured in magazines and invited to speak at universities, not just as a publisher, but as a symbol of a new paradigm where merit, not pedigree, was the currency of success. The imposter syndrome that had haunted her for years had finally been vanquished, replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence in her own worth. One afternoon, while reviewing a manuscript, her head of publicity knocked on her open office door. "You might want to see this," she said, holding out a tablet displaying an article from a major publishing trade journal. The headline read, "Blackwood dropped by publisher after dismal sales of latest novel." Alara read the article with a detached sense of curiosity. Seraphina's follow-up novel, rushed to print, had been a colossal failure. Critics, no longer swayed by her family name and now aware of her character, had savaged it for the very things the Gilded Page had always pointed out: a lack of depth, an absence of humanity, a narrative voice deaf to the world outside its own privileged bubble. The public, now aware of her infamous takedown of Alara, had stayed away in droves. Stripped of her mystique and revealed as a common bully, her brand had become toxic. Her publisher, citing disappointing market performance and a shift in strategic focus, had terminated her multi-book contract. She hadn't just lost face, she had lost the one thing that truly mattered in her world, her status. It wasn't a victory Alara savored, but a quiet affirmation of a principle she held dear. In the end, character is destiny. A week later, Alara was interviewing a potential new author. Her name was Maya, a young, nervous woman from rural Idaho who had written a brilliant, haunting debut novel on her laptop while working 2 jobs at a local diner. She clutched her manuscript to her chest, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. I don't have an MFA," Maya stammered. "I've never been to a writer's conference. I just wrote this." Alara looked at the young woman and saw a reflection of her younger self. She saw the same raw talent, the same fire, and the same fear of being judged unworthy. But instead of meeting that fear with the icy disdain she had once faced, Alara leaned forward with a warm, encouraging smile. "Maya," she said, her voice gentle, "I don't care about MFAs or conferences. I started this company with money I saved waitressing. Tell me about your story. Tell me why you had to write it." As Maya began to speak, her nervousness melting away under Alara's genuine interest, Alara felt a profound sense of peace. This was the true resolution. It wasn't Seraphina's downfall or the magazine covers. It was this, the ability to build a bigger table, to hold the door open for others, to ensure that the next generation of storytellers would be judged not by where they came from, but by the power and passion of their words. She had faced the snobbery of the old guard and emerged not just victorious, but as the architect of a newer, better world. Her success was no longer just her own, it was a promise to every other person with a dream, proving that a story born of struggle and truth will always shine brighter than one born of privilege and prejudice.